again. Welcome back, everyone, to session number 2 of UXPA Minnesota World Usability Day. We've got Jonathan Mann and Lisa Maynard here joining us from Renaissance Learning. I'm going to give a quick introduction to them, and then we'll turn it over for their talk. So Jonathan is Vice President of User Experience Design at Renaissance, and he and his team help accelerate learning there for K-12 students and educators through delightful product design and the ethical application of behavioral science. And previous to Renaissance, he led UX at Target and at PayPal, so some big names there. Lisa Maynard leads UX research at Renaissance Learning, and previous to that, she conducted user research on military vehicles, wayfinding systems, soldier information systems, and night vision goggles for the US and Canadian military. So very interesting work. Did the math, and together they have a combined 45 plus years of research and design experience. So you're getting some real superpower here today, talking about how you can design trust in algorithms when people trust their gut. I will stop sharing and they will take over and take us into our next session. And once again, throw those questions into Q&A as you come up with them. And at the end of the talk, we will address as many as we can.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Andy. Thanks so much, Margaret, and happy World Usability Day to everybody. Really happy to be here with Lisa from my team. I and my teams, at least my former teams, have a long history with supporting World Usability Day, including hosting it for a couple of years here in the Twin Cities. So happy to be back. And I also had the privilege to present to the UXPA. So happy to be back again for joining you with this great event. So the topic that we're going to be talking about, Lisa and I, are how do we design trust in algorithms, which is an interesting follow-on to Holly's last talk, where you've got these kind of nefarious algorithms out there, and in many ways you could say DuckDuckGo was created as a response to people that didn't want to engage with these nefarious algorithms. But the topic of our talk is that there are good algorithms, and algorithms can be a net positive if they're designed well, but there's often a human mistrust in these algorithms. So we're going to talk about, I'm going to talk about some secondary research that I found about why people don't trust algorithms, why maybe you should trust algorithms, and then we'll hand it over to Lisa to talk about some primary research that she and her team have done with educators about their feelings about data. And then we'll come back and we'll talk a little bit about some approaches to how to present data and recommendations to educators. And I would love to have a conversation with all of you that are presenting or attending today, because frankly, we don't know exactly how to do this. And now that we have all these great designers and researchers and other thought leaders here on this call, well, we might as well leverage them and get your great thoughts. So next slide, Lisa. Before we get into it, just a little bit about Renaissance Learning. Just like DuckDuckGo, Renaissance is also a mission-driven company. It is the primary reason that I joined the company, because I have a background in education. I feel passionate about education, and it's not just words. Our mission to accelerate learning for all children and adults of all ability levels and ethnic and social backgrounds worldwide. Those are just not words. You can see it every day in the things that we do on the ground. Many of the people that work at the company are former educators or come from a long history of ed tech, and everybody feels passionately about the field of education and the good that educational technology can do for accelerating learning. And related to our topic, we feel, first of all, Renaissance has more data than just about any other ed tech company about how students are performing and how teachers are doing with that. And we feel strongly that that data can be leveraged for good with thoughtful algorithms to help teachers make the best decisions possible and indeed accelerate this learning. So next slide, Lisa. To get started, let's just watch a short video. So I'll just have Lisa play that.
Let's say you're in London. You need to get from the London Eye to Buckingham Palace. Taxi! Buckingham Palace, please.
We would leave on our right Belvedere Road, left Chicheley Street, right
Wait,
York Road.
you know the whole route already?
Well, we have to. All London black cab drivers have to have completed the knowledge. We need to know all the streets and roads in London to provide that service.
All
The knowledge is the test that you have to pass in order to become a London taxi driver. It's the toughest taxi test in the world. You have to learn 320 routes around London, so that's 640 quarter of a mile areas. You have to learn 25,000 streets and roads within a 6-mile radius of Trafalgar Square in London. You have to learn every single point of interest, place of interest, apartment building, housing estate, police station, mosques, synagogue, churches, everything, anywhere where a paying passenger may want to go.
On average, it takes 2 to 4 years to learn the knowledge. 1 in 5 who attempt the knowledge actually pass. That's the same success rate as a US Navy SEAL. GPS and sat-navs are banned in the exam, but why not use them on the streets?
My GPS is here, and if we get somewhere and we see a road's closed, we need to say, right, that's closed, but I know that if I go left here, that will take me there. If I go right here, that will take me there. We need to be able to do all that as well as having a conversation with the person in the back and solving the world's problems at the same time.
So quite amazing. You can go to the next slide, Lisa. So quite amazing, these London cabbie drivers literally have to memorize pretty much every street in London, an amazing feat. And what's interesting is you heard that little quip towards the end of that driver saying, my GPS is in my head, because in modern days, right, like you and I will have our phones with us and modern GPS, and we could probably get around London not that bad, other than the fact that the steering wheel is on the opposite side for us as Americans. But we could probably get along pretty good, maybe not as good as these cabbie drivers that have so much experience. And I'm sure you'll agree that there are times where you feel like, hey, Google Maps or Waze or whatever is telling me to do something, and I sort of just have this intuition, you know what, I'm gonna take that other bridge over there. And indeed, usually the GPS is correct. And it's an example of sometimes we trust our gut over these algorithms that tend to be pretty reliable. So let's talk a little bit about that. So you can go to the next slide. So first of all, before we get started, just to ground us all, like, what is an algorithm? And for many people, we feel like algorithm is this modern thing that modern computers have brought about, but algorithms actually date back to antiquity, and I'm going to mangle his name, but the the person who is often considered the father of algorithms is Muhammad bin Musa al-Khwarizmi, I hope I'm saying it right, and also known as algorithmy. And what you see there is an ancient scroll with Farsi on it that actually has an ancient algorithm on it. For our purposes, the definition that we're going to use is an algorithm is a series of instructions telling a computer how to transform data about the world into useful information. So basically, it's a tool that transforms data that we might have into things that can help us make smart decisions if they're designed well. Okay, next slide. So why should we trust these algorithms? You've already heard about these London cab drivers that might, feel a little bit ambiguous or ambivalent, I should say, about algorithms. Why should we trust algorithms over our own decision making? And one thing I'll mention, I'm going to get to this in a bit. You see, I have in parentheses, good algorithms. I'm going to talk a little bit later about what we mean by a good algorithm. So assuming it's a good algorithm, why should we trust it? So this is going to be a bit controversial, but you can go to the next slide. The first one is, in many cases, not all cases, but in many cases, algorithms are actually correct more often than human experts. So there's been many studies done about this. And for the studies that I cite, by the way, it's on the slide there. So there's the slide down there for the one that I'm talking about right here with Paul Meehl. So in the late 80s, and this is with not very modern computing power, Paul Meehl put together some simple formulas, simple algorithms, and tested them against experts in the medical field, the judicial field, financial field, the business field. And I won't go into the details here, but in many cases, the algorithm actually outperformed these experts in making decisions, that were later tested to be correct or not. And then what's even more interesting is when these experts were given access to formulas, they did even worse. So that was also an interesting takeaway from this study. So reason number one is oftentimes if it's a well-designed algorithm, it's going to be correct more often than a human expert. Okay, next slide. The second one, and I lump myself into this because I also do not completely understand probability, but humans often misunderstand probability. And there's many examples I could cite here, but I've chosen just 4. So one way that humans misunderstand probability is we often confuse probability with propensity. So let's think about like a fictional educator who has a student, and she's getting information about the student that's showing maybe that she's not going to pass the state exam on something. She'll often revert to propensity thinking, oh, this student, let's call her Morgan. This student Morgan is a hard worker. She shows up on time. She gets her assignments in on time. She performs well in these other subjects. So she has a propensity for being a great student. So I don't think that this prediction that she's not going to do well is accurate. Well, that's different. Propensity is different from probability, and people often fall into thinking about propensity when they really should be thinking about probability. The next one is not taking into account base rate, and we as humans do this quite often. I think you and me often will get like some symptom, and then we'll Google the symptom, and we immediately think that we have some like rare disease. Well, that's an example of not taking into account the base rate. What you're not seeing is like, yes, you might experience 1 or 2 of these symptoms, but rare diseases are by nature rare. And if you're not taking into account the base rate that says that 1 in a million people actually have this disease, you're probably overreacting to this. And that's an example of not taking into account the base rate. Another way that we misunderstand probability is through something called the availability heuristic, which was described by Kahneman and Tversky a while ago. So the availability heuristic is something where we see things in the world, and when we're making decisions, we reference the thing that we've heard about recently. And the media kind of is a bad actor sometimes in this. You probably heard the cliche, if it bleeds, it leads. So the media is reporting on, for example, let's say you hear in your neighborhood, there's a certain corner where people have been mugged a couple of times. And now you're going to be avoiding that corner because you think that it's a super dangerous corner because maybe 2 people have been mugged at that corner. What hasn't been reported, is kind of similar to not taking account of the base rate, is the 2,500,000 times people have walked past that corner and nothing has happened. So the availability heuristic tends to make us think about things that we've heard about recently. And then the last way that we often misunderstand probability is the conjunction fallacy, which was also described by Kahneman and Tversky. And it was done through this thing called the Linda problem, which I have there in that graphic. So first of all, just a little disclaimer, this was in the early 80s when they described this. So please forgive the, kind of the stereotyping of women and putting them into, a declining field of bank teller. Understood that that's probably not the best example in the world, but I'm only using it because they used it in order to describe the conjunction fallacy. So they describe this person, Linda. She's 31 years old, single, outspoken, and very bright. She majored in philosophy. As a student, she was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice and participated in anti-nuclear protest. Which is more likely? Linda is a bank teller. Linda is a bank teller and active in the feminist movement. And so most people in the study chose number 2 because they thought that some of the things in the description of Linda matched the, that conjunction there. But if you think about what's being described here, and you think about it maybe as a Venn diagram, there's people who are bank tellers, there are people that are active in the feminist movement. There's only a small sliver that overlaps. So it's actually far more likely that Linda is just a bank teller and not both a bank teller and active in the feminist movement. And we do this all the time as humans, where we fall for this conjunction fallacy. So these are some of the many ways that we misunderstand probability as humans. And the bottom line is that algorithms, if designed well, do not misunderstand probability. Okay, next slide. The next one is that algorithms can access far more data than we as humans can. So even a human with perfect analytical skills can't easily draw upon the same quantity of data. So thinking about our friends, the London cabbies in that video, yes, they did this amazing feat of memorizing every road, street, bridge, landmark, etc. But what they don't know is today there happens to be a traffic accident at this corner, whereas the GPS would know that. Or today there is road construction that they might not have heard about. Or last week a new road was constructed that they didn't learn about when they were studying for their test. So the algorithm can sometimes have an edge, even if you have perfect analytical skills, just because of the huge amount of data behind it. And then lastly, on the next slide, algorithms don't have bad days. So even if you're perfect at all those other three things that I mentioned, a human is a human, right? So sometimes we don't sleep well, sometimes we don't eat well, sometimes we're in a bad mood, sometimes we don't feel well. All of those things can potentially mess with our cognitive powers and our ability to make rational decisions. Whereas algorithms, unless you unplug the computer, the algorithm is just going to perform the same way from day to day. So algorithms don't have bad days. So just a few reasons that we should trust a well-designed algorithm. Okay, so next slide. And then just to reinforce the thing I said about probability, I don't know if you guys remember the movie from the early 80s, The World According to Garp, but here's a little clip from that. So go ahead and play that.
Folks all right down there?
Yeah, I'm okay. We're all right. But are you all right?
Oh, I'm fine. You mind if I use your phone?
Sure, if you can find it.
Thanks a lot.
We'll take the house.
Garp.
Honey, the chances of another plane hitting this house are astronomical. See, it's been pre-disastered. We're going to be safe here.
So kind of funny, and oops, looks like it's playing it. Kind of funny, and honestly, when I first saw this movie, I'm like, yeah, that's pretty rational thinking. But actually, the reality is that's a misunderstanding of probability, one of the many that we do of humans, right? So the probability of the plane hitting the house again is actually exactly the same as the probability of the plane hitting the house the first time. It's no less likely to happen. And that's just one of the things that we sometimes do as humans is mess up these feelings of probability. All right, next slide, please. So I've already talked about why I feel there are times where we should be trusting algorithms over our own decision making. Why do we sometimes not do that? So let's talk a bit about that. There's many reasons for it, but I have two things that I want to talk about. So first of all, we as humans have this overwhelming tendency and instinct to default to emotional thinking. So many of you read the classic book by Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow, where he talks about system 1 versus system 2 thinking, where system 1 is our emotional thinking, system 2 is our rational thinking. So rational thinking takes up quite a bit of cognitive load. It's hard. It's just like using a muscle. And we get tired after a while doing a lot of rational thinking, whereas emotional decisions tend to be effortless. And so we just kind of sometimes just do it just because we're getting tired. And it's just a way that we've evolved as human beings. Related to that, we have innate heuristics and cognitive biases. So the heuristics helped us make quick decisions, and the biases are adaptations to give us fallbacks positions when we're unsure to act. And, I have that picture there of these ancient hunter-gatherers being attacked by this wild animal. And if they were to rely on their rational thinking, they'd be like, this large animal is running after me, and it's, got large teeth and horns, and it weighs a lot more than me. And by the time they figured out that, maybe they should run away, they'd probably be trampled and eaten. So they're falling back on their instincts is one of the ways that we've survived as human beings. So our emotional thinking is good for us, and it's one of the things that we've helped us evolve as human beings, but it's also one of the reasons why we might be adverse to more rational ways of thinking. So if you go to the next slide. The other thing is the thing called algorithm aversion, which was described by Berkeley Dietforst. I think I'm pronouncing his name okay. And there's the citation down on the bottom of the page. So algorithm aversion is something related to the above, or the last slide, where people quickly lose trust in algorithms if they fail. So that's a natural thing, and you can understand that if you hear about an algorithm that doesn't perform or makes a mistake, you might lose trust in it. But what's fascinating is that even when people are shown data that the algorithm still outperforms humans, they don't trust the algorithm anymore. So they would rather have humans that make more decisions rather than an algorithm that makes fewer decisions. The next one is, or related to that, is humans want to blame somebody when things go wrong. And I attended a fascinating talk by a woman, I believe she was at Yale University, Renee Richardson Gosselin, who's done some studies on people who tend towards more system one thinking or tend towards more system two thinking. So in other words, people who tend to do more emotional thinking versus people who tend to do more rational thinking. And those who tend to favor system one or the emotional thinking are the ones that mostly fall into algorithm aversion, which is interesting. All right, next slide, please. And then let's just watch a video of a person that you probably have heard of and talking about trusting your gut.
All of my best decisions in business and in life have been made with heart, intuition, guts, not analysis. When you can make a decision with analysis, you should do so. But it turns out in life that your most important decisions are always made with instinct, intuition, taste, heart.
So interesting, so formerly the world's richest man, I guess now he's the world's second richest man, but he's talked about, the importance of trusting your gut for things. So, it's a common thing to do. What he doesn't talk about is, maybe some of the bad decisions that came from trusting his gut. But indeed, we should there are times where we should trust our gut for certain things. And there are times where rational thinking and algorithms aren't going to help us, but there are times when they can. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Okay, I think this is the next slide is less. So, so I mentioned earlier that we would only want to drive trust in algorithms if they're quote unquote good algorithms. And there are algorithms that are not quote unquote good. So there are probably many more characteristics than I've listed here, but I've listed 3 characteristics that we should look at to make sure that we as designers, if there's an algorithm we think can drive decision making, why we should, analyze it first to make sure it's, again, quote unquote good. The first one is to make sure that the algorithms don't have any bias coded into them. And if you haven't seen it, there's an amazing movie called Coded Bias. And Lisa and I had the privilege actually where the producers of that movie came and gave a talk to our entire company about the making of the movie. We had a screening of the movie and we had a Q&A about it. And coded bias does indeed exist quite a bit in the algorithms that are around us in the world, usually they're not with bad intentions. They're just done with ignorance, and they're done, by people who are not thinking about the diverse population that, for which they're designing these algorithms. And, a really terrible example is the image that I have here, where millions of Black people were affected by racial bias in healthcare algorithms. So terrible outcomes, and those are definitely not good algorithms, and they need to be fixed and improved. The next one that you should look at to make sure this is a good algorithm is that decisions and recommendations should be leading to positive outcomes. And we can think about all sorts of algorithms that we encounter in the world. So Facebook, I'll just call them out in this. So Facebook has been in the news lately because some of their algorithms have been leading to, they're maybe not the best for the people who are using them. As there's that saying that you're really not the user, you're not the customer, you're the product. And if the algorithm is driving engagement so you could look at a bunch of ads, that's maybe not an algorithm for the good of society. So is this algorithm for the good of society? Is it for the good of the person that's using this algorithm? So that's something that you should be looking at carefully. And then lastly, this is maybe, another part of the coded bias, but it's something you should look at more broadly. Make sure this algorithm doesn't have unintentional consequences. So there's probably many examples of algorithms that were put out in the world where they may have performed as they were designed, but they had unintentional consequences that weren't thought of. Like an example that I've thought of is the driving app Waze, which often puts people on these side roads, and it starts driving traffic into neighborhoods that were never built for this traffic, and it really degrades the quality of life for the people that live in that neighborhood. That's an example of an unintentional consequence. Sorry. All right, so next slide. So now I'm going to hand it over to Lisa, who's she and her team has done a lot of amazing research with educators. And so let's take a look at the way that educators feel about the data that we sometimes put in front of them.
Thank you, Jonathan. So now we're going to talk about what we've learned from our research, understand a little bit about what teachers' current pain points are and their attitudes towards data and algorithms. So from numerous interviews and interactions with teachers, we've learned that teachers have a lot of demands on them. They're trying to educate 20 to 30 students in a classroom, or if you're in a middle school, high school teacher, you could have multiple classes of students. And some of their main pain points are they're really trying to keep students engaged in the learning process, whether it's remote or in class. And they're overwhelmed with having so many products. We've been listening to teachers list 10, 15, 20 ed tech products that they are incorporating into their classroom and working with and using them with their students. And that obviously has increased with the pandemic, how they used more ed tech products just with the remote learning that occurred then and still continuing on. And what has resulted and what has always happened is that they're uncertain how to read and interpret data from all those ed tech products, all the other products they're using, as well as the paper and pencil assessments and assignments that they're giving their students. And what they're really trying to answer from all this data is like, what do my students already know? What do they need to learn? Or what did they learn? What gaps do they still have? And what should I do next with my students? And then they're time strapped. They're trying to build relationships with students. They're teaching, they're planning, they're marking, and they just run out of time and how to deal with all this information that they have. And then they also have the challenge of trying to find quality practice instruction that they want to use in their classroom. So let's take a brief moment and talk about some of the data that we have at Renaissance. So one of our flagship products is the STAR assessments. And this is a computer adaptive test. It's a test that gives students 35 multiple choice questions. And if the student gets a question correct, the next question will be harder. And if the student gets a question wrong, the next question will be easier. And the assessment keeps adjusting the questions up and down based on how the student responds to the questions. By the end of the 34 choice, multiple choice questions, the system knows where the student is at in the Renaissance's learning progression. And this is really quite impressive that we can determine this much about a student in 20 minutes. The assessment takes about 20 minutes for a student to take. And Renaissance has over 2.8 billion data points to help develop these STAR assessments and decades of research that have proven that it's a reliable and valid assessment. And just to kind of explain what a learning progression is. So we've developed a learning progression, which is really the teachable order that students learn skills. And this has been based on all the data that we've collected over the years. And the STAR assessment can place a student into the learning progression. So place a student into one of these boxes of where they would be on this English language arts learning progression here. And then we can tell them, well, since they're here, this is likely what they're ready to learn next of where the student is at. So again, this is based on millions of students' assessment results. And in this instance, the STAR assessment algorithm, has more data than a teacher has. It's based on all these data points from students all across the US versus just their experience that they've had with the students in their classroom. So now I'm just going to show you an audio clip from a reading specialist that we've interviewed, just to give you a bit more of a one-on-one personal sense on how teachers' attitudes towards data and algorithms. And it's a little quiet, this one audio, but we have the text of what she's saying here on this slide as well.
Well, I trust what I know. I trust what I see. Because like I mentioned a few minutes ago, a test doesn't define a student. Some students are not good test takers. They're just not. When you see them every day in your classroom and you see them blossoming, you see them learning, you see the light bulb come on, you have to take that along with the data that you're seeing.
Okay.
Their growth.
And what information about your students do you trust the least?
The state test.
And why is that?
Because it's just one little snapshot. Kids are always so nervous when they take the test. Our kids have always done really well. They are prepared, but just to see them so nervous, when it's test day, it's hard on them. And that just can't capture their entire year of learning.
So in this instance, even though the test results or the data could often be more correct than humans, this reading specialist, she really wants to trust her gut and her impressions on what she sees in the classroom over the data. And her system one's kind of taking over with the emotional thinking and the relationships and what she's seeing in the classroom. And go to the next slide. So now I'm just going to play another clip from another teacher just to give you some more perspective.
Well, I think the way that we use it currently works well because of the fact that we would get the data. So let's say they take their STAR test. We would come together as like a fourth grade team. We would talk about our scores, talk about our kids, ask how'd that kid do better, what are you doing in your classroom. Then we'd also have those conversations with our principal. Our principal would look at the data, but we would have the conversation and bring the whole child in. There was a time in our district where we had a reading consultant, and she would come in and have no idea who the kids are. That wasn't her. She didn't care. She just looked at the numbers. And I think the hardest part of working with that person was the fact that when we tried saying the reasons why this kid scored the way they did, she kind of looked at it more as an excuse instead of understanding the score.
Okay. And what would have you wanted her to do differently?
Understand that a kid's more than a number.
Okay. So again, this teacher, they're really relying on like what they're seeing in the classroom than just on the test score. And she was really quite frustrated by this reading consultant who just wanted to look at the data and not know anything or really take in anything more in about the child or about the student. And, one of the points that Jonathan made earlier is that, experts, if they rely on their formula and their expert opinions, sometimes they come to wrong conclusions. So it's interesting how this one person just wanted to stay with the formula or the algorithm to come to conclusions, and other people wanted to use their expert opinion as well as the data or the formula to come to the conclusion. So hopefully, this didn't make judgment worse. So I'm now just going to talk about something that happened in Texas in 2010. Texas had a new measure called the Texas Projection Measure. And it was a measure that looked at students' previous scores to project future scores. This new measure was quite controversial, as you can see in the sub-headline there. How a student who got every question wrong on a TAKS writing test could be scored as passing it. Like, how could that be? The algorithm used was a backwards-looking algorithm. So children who passed the reading or math test were likely to pass other tests in the future. The predictions were based on aggregates of all student data and not just students with identical scoring patterns. So this resulted with some students who failed the TAKS test were actually counted as a pass, since the algorithm was based on past performance and not specifically that one instance. People were very upset with this inconsistent and hard to explain data. They thought they were being misled in a public hearing and couldn't believe this bizarre system that turned a test score of 0 to a passing score. They didn't believe that this Texas projection measure, even though overall it was 90% accurate at projections. And it was probably correct more often than educators would be in predicting student performance. It's kind of an example of algorithm aversion, since the algorithm failed in some instances, so people were just ready not to trust it at all. And I'm just going to share one other study about an algorithm that turned out to be more correct than students' and teachers' predictions. So they wanted to create a measure to predict grade 8 students' college readiness, and they called it a middle school indicator. And there's a huge desire that if you can detect earlier if a student needs an intervention or a course correction, that's always better than waiting later because you have more time for the intervention. So they looked at multiple data points for the measure that could consider, and this shares the percentage of what's contributed to predicting whether a student's going to be ready for college. So what in their formula, they discovered that academic achievement had about 17% towards the prediction. Motivation was about 15%, behavior was about 14%, family circumstances were 12%, social engagement 7%, and school characteristics were 3%. So academic achievement was only 17%, but if you look at motivation and behavior of that student, those two factors contributed more than just what the test scores or academic achievement would. And what they found is 15% of the students that were part of this data set that believed their chances of going to college were very high, or had teachers believed that they could go to college. 45% of those 15% would have been flagged by this indicator, that if they did not have any intervention, they would not be going to college, and that this was with a 90% confidence. So this shows that teachers need more help in efficiently identifying students who are off track. And algorithms can sometimes be considered, can consider data more objectively to come to a more accurate conclusion. And then I'll turn it back over to you, Jonathan.
Great, thanks, Lisa. So we've heard from Lisa, and I think I saw some of the comments flash on there. These educators are amazing. Without fail, when we talk to teachers, you hear over and over again the empathy and love that they have for their students, which is great. And for my own kids, I would want teachers like that. So what we want to do at Renaissance is help these teachers make the best decisions, help them with the data that we have, and hopefully well-designed algorithms that we have, make choices that lead to positive educational outcomes. And also, you saw that in the teacher problems that Lisa was mentioning. One of the biggest stresses that teachers have is they just don't have enough time. So a well-designed algorithm that helps take the load off and help the teacher make smart decisions can also save them time. So how might we do that? And then, the thing that's not mentioned there, how might we do that, but also have them trust the recommendation that we're having, which might sometimes differ from the things that they're seeing and inferring when they're looking at the students in their class. So I have a couple of sketches of things here, and I would love, as I show them, to get people's thoughts about what you think is the best approach, or if none of these, what you would recommend as an approach. So if you go to the next slide. So here's a fictional situation, which is actually not completely too far off from something that we would encounter. So imagine there's a middle school teacher named Ms. Murphy, and we have data that indicates that one of her students, named, who we'll call Morgan, is struggling with linear equations. What's the best way to present this to Ms. Murphy? And so again, I have 4 suggestions here, and let's take a look at them. And then, in the chat or whatever is the best way of doing that, I would love to hear people's thoughts about, the best approach. So go to the next slide. So here's approach number 1. So in this approach, we've got this screen that's showing data about Morgan, and it's really not making any recommendations to Ms. Murphy. Basically, it's just showing a bunch of data, and it shows that, Morgan is doing fine with fractions, geometry, and measurement, but is falling behind in algebra. And we just kind of leave it there. So we're essentially saying, here's a bunch of data, and we trust you, Ms. Murphy, to make the best decisions based on that data. Okay, so that's approach number 1. Approach number 2 might be that we have some algorithm in the background that's analyzing the data. So the algorithm analyzes the data and makes a recommendation for some intervention that Ms. Murphy can assign to Morgan. So as you can see there, like we would have maybe some modal that would appear, and it says Morgan is struggling with linear equations. We recommend these practice exercises, and then Ms. Murphy can tap on one or both of those and just assign those to Morgan for remedial practice. Okay, and then approach number 3 is similar to that. So we've got that same algorithm in the background making the recommendation, the same recommendations for practice. But in this case, Ms. Murphy can click on decline the recommendation to opt out of this recommendation from the algorithm. And then another screen would appear asking Ms. Murphy, why is this? What's the reason that you're declining this? And it could be, Morgan wasn't feeling that well, the test didn't accommodate something that Morgan needed, there was some issue with the technology or something where she could tell us why, and then that feedback would get submitted. And then the last approach could be something like this, where the algorithm analyzes the data and then without asking, just goes ahead and assigns it. So Morgan is struggling with linear equations. We assign these practice exercises, and then Ms. Murphy would say, got it. And so it basically is frictionless, and Morgan just gets these exercises assigned. So if you go to the next slide, we'll sort of have a review of these. So I don't know, moderators, if anybody's put anything in the chat, but if you would just, I'd be interested, and we would be interested in hearing folks' thoughts about what approach, if any, you think might be the best for this. And if any, if you have any other thoughts, we'd love to hear about those too. So I'll just wait a couple minutes for those to come into the chat.
Yeah, we've got some people putting in their opinions here. We have approach 2 or 3, there's a vote for approach 4, excuse me. And then a note here, approach 3 keeps the control with the teacher. A few more votes for approach 3 here coming in, seems to be the preferred one so far. Another vote for 3.
Another vote for 3. All right.
3 again. 3.
3.
And here's a note, one more, I think 4, but could it allow a withdrawal? Daryl, I assume, are you meaning allowing to decline? Kind of like step 3 or something else if you want to.
He probably means, you know, it gets assigned, but Ms. Murphy could have the power to say, you know, unassign it. I'm guessing.
Right. Okay. Could decline the new assignments. And there's a note I'd like to see his approaches tested with real users and see what their feedback is.
Yep. Well, just a note about that. So what we're doing here, so that, you know, this is sort of a dual purpose, you know, thing, or at least dual purpose design challenge. So it's not just what the most usable is, where we could put it in front of users and get some sort of, you know, objective feedback about that, but we also want to drive trust in the algorithm. And that might, you know, maybe you could get that indirectly, but like, you know, putting it in front of users, I guess you could hear some qualitative feedback, but sometimes you might just have to even put it live and see what happens. All right, well, it looks like we're toning down. It sounds like most people are tending towards 3. Interestingly, did anybody put number 1? I don't think anybody put that.
I didn't see any votes for number 1.
Okay, so it was mostly for 3, I think a couple for 2, and then a few for 4, or 4 with a caveat. I would tend to, you know, agree with that. You know, and just to be clear, we're still thinking about this. So this is legitimately just asking. This is not that we have a firm feeling about it, but all of these, frankly, have some advantages. Number 1 is probably the most quote unquote respectful of Ms. Murphy's professional judgment. It's basically saying, here's a bunch of data, Ms. Murphy, do with it as you wish. You know, we're just kind of telling you that Morgan's falling behind, but you know, you're just gonna, you'll be able to figure out what to do with this. Number 2 is fairly easy to do. It's like, you know, here's something we're noticing, and you know, go ahead and assign these. Number 3 is nice because you can go ahead and assign these, but then you can decline it, and then you can have the opportunity to give feedback, and maybe even, you know, the designers of the algorithm could potentially even learn from it and make the algorithm smarter, right? So not only does Ms. Murphy have some autonomy here and agency, but she has the ability to help train the algorithm a little bit better. And then the last one is potentially nice because it's probably the most frictionless, right? Because she doesn't have to do anything. It just auto assigns it. So if you go to the next slide, Lisa, here are just a few thoughts about this. So suggestions for driving trust in algorithms. So I'm going to give a big fat caveat that the only one of these that I have confidence in is the first one, because it comes from an actual study. And the next 3 are just our opinions about it. And I would, you know, be very open to hearing contrary feedback, because these could be wrong. So the first one, the one that I do have confidence in, is part of the reason why option 3 could be a good choice. So there is a study by that same guy, Dietforst, who described algorithm aversion. He did a follow-up study, like how do you counter algorithm aversion, and found that it can drive quite significant amounts of trust building if you give the user some measure of control, even if it's quite small and insignificant. That helps to drive trust in the algorithm. So that study is listed there. It's from 2016, if you care to look at it. The next one is a double-edged sword, and it, you know, would be the devil is in the details about how well this is done, because it actually could completely backfire. So one of the suspicions that people sometimes have about algorithms is they can be a bit of a black box. So if you can, like in the case of Ms. Morgan, if you could potentially tell her, how the algorithm was developed and some of the things that drive it, that potentially could help her trust it more because she kind of knows what's behind it. But again, that's with the big fat caveat that sometimes the more information you give about an algorithm, the less trust people have. And that graphic I have, I stole from a Wired article. I don't cite it here, but there was a Wired article showing how a college professor was using an algorithm for grading papers. And when he described it, his students trusted it even less. So it did backfire there. Another one is, contrary to what we often do as UX designers, maybe you could consider adding friction, saying, hey, we're about to make this recommendation, and maybe provide an opportunity for the user, the teacher, Ms. Murphy, to consider it before moving forward so that she doesn't feel like, she was steamrolled past and she actually had a chance to think about whether to take this recommendation or not. And then lastly, this is another one that could easily backfire, but it's sort of related to the second bullet, is proactively consider addressing when the algorithm might be incorrect or perceived to be off. So, an algorithm is never going to be perfect. The hope is that it's superior in most cases to human decisions. So, if you tell them when it might be off, maybe that could help drive trust, but again, that could completely backfire. And I think that's our last slide. Is that right, Lisa? Yep, so we just have this one little video. I don't know, I think we're starting to run out of time, so I don't know if we wanted to take questions.
Yeah, we can just take questions.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jonathan and Lisa. I appreciate sharing all these thoughts. We've got one question that came in through Q&A. We got a few kind of back through the chat. So we'll start with Q&A and then try to cover as many as we can. So Ellie Harstad asks, Jonathan, do you have a preferred way of exploring whether an algorithm has unintentional consequences before it's released into the wild?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So you kind of have to think about a lot of cases. Like I frankly think the example that I gave for Waze probably should have thought about that, or maybe they even did and just, went forward anyway. But sometimes, honestly, because it's unintentional, like by definition, you haven't probably thought about it. So sometimes it needs to go into the wild. So maybe if you could have like a slow release to kind of see what happens and then just be on the lookout for it. But it is a good question and something that I've thought about for also. And it is difficult to do, very much proactively before it's out there.
All right. And Miranda Lepore wrote, how does this address, I think she's talking about those 4 options that we looked at here around 11:05 a.m. How does this address the full picture both of those teachers mentioned? This seems to be just gauging test scores.
Not sure.
And yeah, Miranda, if you're still there, do you want to provide some additional information on that?
Well, I can try to respond to that. At Renaissance, we believe that the teacher should be part of the process and not just necessarily, kids just sitting in front of computers, answering questions after a test and then going into practice. We do feel like the teachers should be part of it because they do have additional information than just what the test score would have.
Mm-hmm. And so it sounds like no software, no algorithm can fully account for that because that's the human knowledge. That's something that they uniquely bring, right? Mm-hmm. So you're supporting their work, but you really can't fully address that full picture within anything you provide. You can only add to it.
Yep. Our software, just as one quick follow on, our software is intended to be supplemental, so the teacher is the focal point and center of the classroom, and our software is supposed to just help him or her with that. We actually do have at least one competitor. It's just kind of robo teaching where it almost removes the teacher from it, and we've never had that philosophy.
Great. And then there's, I a question, I guess you can take this any way that you want, but Daryl's asking, what if students just don't perform well in a testing environment? I guess the question is then, how do you account for that in an algorithm?
So the best practices that we advise with teachers is, test scores fluctuate within a single student, and it's best to look at test scores over time, for one thing. And then another thing that we're still attempting to do at our company, since we have a lot of practice products as well. We have Accelerated Reader, we have Freckle, we have Mion, which is a digital library. Freckle it has ELA and math practice, is to bring that data in as well as with the test scores in order to give recommendations. So it wouldn't just be solely the test score then. So that's evolving. We haven't completely cracked that nut yet, but that is something that we're working on.
All right. We've got a question from Liz Welter. Says 2 points. One, it's difficult to have a conversation about algorithms without also mentioning the integrity of the data feeding the algorithm. And 2, clear statements of scope and applicability, i.e. applicability to neurodiverse populations. Any thoughts on those points?
Completely agree. Yeah, and I mean, it's a very long conversation, but I don't disagree with any of that. I'll just say that. I think it was more of a statement than a question, so I just say I would agree with it. Yeah,
it sounds like more of a statement than a question, I guess. To build on that, maybe is there any particular example you can cite for how you've taken that into consideration? Like, let's take that specific example of a neurodiverse population. Can you give an example of how that's accounted for?
Maybe not specifically for educational software. We do have, maybe somewhat unrelated to this topic of algorithms, but we do have, in fact, it's something that my team is working on right now. We're working on extensive accommodations for not just neurodiverse, but all sorts of things that kids might encounter when taking tests, ADHD, people who get triggered by certain color contrasts, all sorts of things like that. So we are taking that into account. It's maybe a larger discussion about the algorithm that's behind it, but certainly for the test taking part of it, we're working on that.
All right, great. I'm going to ask one more question and I think we'll wrap up. Thanks again, everyone, for the questions here. Jalen Evan asks, how do you make sure a good algorithm remains a good algorithm as the world changes?
That's a very good question. So yeah, I mean, it probably does need to be tweaked and toned as time goes on. Honestly, maybe I should have clarified this. So neither Lisa nor I are data scientists. So we do have a team of data scientists and we also have psychometricians. So they're the ones in the background that are creating these algorithms. And then we as designers and researchers are the one that are kind of presenting whatever comes from that. So they would be better to answer that question, but I agree that they do need to be tweaked and refined over time to account for things that change in the world.
All right. Well, Lisa and Jonathan, thanks again so much. Really enjoyed this talk. I appreciated having you here today.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having us. And we forgot to put in a little plug that we are hiring. So if you would like to be part of this and actually be working on specifically the research for it, we're growing our research team. So we'd love to have you. Thanks again for having us.